In part 1, Diep discovered the warning hidden in the bamboo grove, and the letter with no name, the one that whispered, "He hasn't forgotten you." But part 1 was only the beginning, because the danger that brushed past their window, the presence that made Don growl, the silence that followed James home, none of it was random. Some stories don't start with strangers. Some stories begin with the people we trust the most, the ones whose shadows stretch farther than we ever realized. This morning, in the small wooden house where hope had just begun to settle, the truth finally cracks open. A truth tied not to the forest, not to the journey, but to James's past, to the man who shaped him, to the man he ran from. And today, you will witness the moment that past collides with their present and threatens everything they've fought for. If you've followed James and Tu Diep through every fear, every step, every heartbeat, please consider subscribing our small channel. Your support keeps this little series alive and truly means the world to us. Now, part 2 begins. The morning light crept gently across the wooden floor, warm and soft. But inside the house, not a single person felt at peace. James lay propped up against the wall, breathing steadier now, but still carrying a fog of exhaustion in his eyes. Diep sat beside him, one hand resting on his arm, the other pressing a cool, damp cloth to his forehead. Even though the fever had broken hours ago, she couldn't stop trembling. The memory of him collapsing, limp, burning, barely conscious, clung to her like smoke. On a small stool near the door, Nee sat quietly with Don in her lap. The little girl clung to the dog's fur, her cheek pressed into his back. Don's eyes stayed locked on the doorway, muscles tight, ears raised, waiting for the slightest sound. Mrs. Huyen stood by the window, glancing between the bamboo grove and the man lying on the bed. The lines on her forehead deepened with each breath. "Diep," she whispered finally, "that shadow this morning, are you sure it was just an animal?" Diep didn't answer, because deep down, she already knew the truth. Too many strange things had happened these past weeks. Too many whispers. Too many warnings carried by people who spoke as if someone was always listening. And then there was the letter, folded in her pocket now, creased, worn, touched too many times. No sender, no signature, only one chilling line. "He hasn't forgotten you." Diep had hidden it from James. He was injured. He was barely home. How could she place one more fear on his shoulders? Before she could speak, the crunch of footsteps echoed from the yard. Firm, steady, deliberate. Don growled, low and dangerous. Diep stood immediately. A heartbeat later, a familiar voice called from the gate. "Diep, it's me, Lee." Diep exhaled shakily. Officer Lee stepped into the yard, removing his helmet. His expression was serious in a way she rarely saw. He bowed politely to Mrs. Huyen, nodded at Nee, and stepped inside. His eyes fell on James and widened at the bandages. "You weren't exaggerating," he murmured to Diep. He really did push himself too far. James tried to sit straighter. "It's not as bad as it looks." Lee gave him a pointed look that meant it was exactly as bad as it looked. Diep moved aside as Lee knelt beside the bed. "We need to talk," Lee said quietly. "All of us." The room stilled. Diep closed the door behind him, shutting out the morning light. "Diep told me about the shadow outside," Lee continued. "And this isn't the first sign something is wrong." He glanced toward the window, the same one where the curtains had fluttered earlier, as if brushed by a passing hand. Nee whimpered softly, clutching Dawn's fur until her knuckles turned white. "It's not random," Lee said. "Someone was here. Someone who knew James just returned." Diep's throat tightened. "Officer Lee, there's something else." Her voice wavered. "I got a letter, a few days ago." She pulled it from her pocket with shaking hands. Lee unfolded it. His expression darkened instantly. Diep swallowed. "Do you know who sent it?" Lee shook his head. "No name, no handwriting I recognize. But this..." He lifted the paper. "This is not a prank. Someone wanted you to see it." James frowned. "Warn her? About what?" Lee didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, the walls, the door, the bamboo grove pressed close behind the house. "It didn't start when James went missing," Lee said softly. "This began earlier, and it's tied to something more personal than we thought." Diep felt her breath catch. She looked at James, but James looked away. Lee continued. "I checked around border stations. Officers have been reporting a man asking about you, Diep. Quietly, persistently, for weeks." Diep's stomach flipped. "Questions? About me? Why? Your full name, your old address, even the orchard where you used to work." Diep felt the world tilt sideways. "Who would... Why?" Lee inhaled slowly, turning to James. "James," he murmured, "I think it's time you tell her." James's body went still. Diep turned toward him, voice shaking. "Tell me what?" James didn't answer. Not yet. Lee stood and gently ushered Mrs. Huyen and Nee outside. "Let them get some air," he said. "We'll continue in a moment." The door closed, leaving only 3 people inside. James, Diep, Lee. The house felt unbearably small, as if its wooden walls were listening. Diep lifted her chin, voice barely above a whisper. "James, what is he talking about?" James swallowed hard. When he finally met her eyes, the pain there wasn't from his leg. "I didn't want to burden you," he began. "Not when you were pregnant. Not when I was fighting to get back home. Not when you were terrified." "Burden me with what?" Diep whispered. James exhaled, a long, exhausted sigh of someone who'd run out of places to hide the truth. "The shadow you saw, the letter, the questions about you." He paused. Diep leaned in, heart pounding. James lowered his gaze. "Diep, there's only one person who would go that far to interfere in my life." Her breath stopped. He lifted his eyes. "My father." Silence slammed into the room like a blow. Diep felt the air leave her lungs. Her hands trembled in her lap. She had expected danger, but not this, not him. "Trans son?" Diep whispered. James nodded slowly, painfully. "James," she breathed, "why would your father know anything about me? Why would he care where I live? Why would he send someone here?" James didn't answer right away. He leaned his head back, eyes shadowed by memories older than the scars on his body. Lee cleared his throat gently. "Diep, before you met James, before the orchard, his father already had a history of control, of manipulation." James flinched, but didn't deny it. Diep shook her head. "But that was between you and him. Why me?" James looked at her, really looked, and the guilt in his eyes was unbearable. "Because I chose you," he whispered, and in his eyes, choosing you meant rejecting him. Diep's chest tightened painfully. James continued, voice cracking. He believes you changed me. He thinks you pulled me away from the life he planned. His business, his expectations, his future for me. He blames you for everything I've become. Diep felt the words slice through her. But that doesn't explain the shadow, she whispered, or the letter, or why someone would follow me. James closed his eyes. Lee stepped forward. James, tell her the rest. James's throat bobbed. When he spoke again, his voice was thin, breaking. Because this isn't the first time he's done it. Diep froze. James's fingers curled into the blanket, knuckles white. When I was younger, he murmured, I tried to leave home once, just for a day, to visit a friend my father didn't approve of. Diep swallowed, afraid to breathe. James stared at the floor, eyes distant. I didn't know he hired someone to follow me. Diep's skin prickled. He confronted me the next morning, told me every step I took, every person I spoke to, every minute I was gone. A tear slid down Diep's cheek. James whispered, I thought he stopped. I thought cutting ties, walking away from the money, the business, would make him let go. But he didn't, Diep whispered. No, James breathed. He didn't. Lee folded his arms. This matches what I found. Someone has been tracking Diep for a long time. Not recently. Long before James disappeared. Diep's voice trembled. James, why didn't you tell me? James looked devastated. Because you deserve peace, he whispered. Because I didn't want you living in fear. Diep wiped her tears, but they kept coming. Lee's voice dropped. Diep, the shadow this morning wasn't random. Someone checked the house, knew where the window is, knew James was back. The room's silence grew heavy. Diep's heart thudded so loudly, she thought it might echo. So what do we do now? She whispered. James looked at her, really looked, and something inside him broke. Diep, he murmured, voice shaking. There's something else. She turned to him slowly. He swallowed hard. My father. He hesitated. Lee placed a steady hand on James's shoulder. James closed his eyes, forcing the truth out. The truth he'd never dared say aloud. Diep? He's done this before. Her breath hitched. James's voice dropped to a fragile whisper. He didn't just follow me. A beat. He followed my mother too. Diep went completely still. James's next words were barely sound. And the worst part? Diep leaned in, heart pounding. James opened his eyes, and in them was an old wound, deep and unhealed. He wasn't trying to protect us. In part 2 of this episode, the quiet morning inside Diep's wooden house shatters when Officer Lee arrives with news that confirms her worst fear. The shadow in the bamboo grove was no accident. As tension rises, Lee reveals someone has been asking about Diep for weeks, someone who knows her past. James, cornered by the truth he's long avoided, finally confesses the unthinkable. The danger following them is not from strangers, but from his own father, a man whose need for control once shaped and scarred his life. The revelations deepen, exposing patterns of manipulation, surveillance, and a history James hoped was buried. Now, Diep realizes the threat is closer than ever, and far more personal.